Hello, I am back and I am reading Behind Closed Doors, the tragic untold story of the Duchess of Windsor. And I am going to just show you this chapter is about the Duke of Windsor who's lying in state. You can see he did have a formal lying in state funeral, and it was done at St. George's Chapel. So it was May 28th, 1972, and he did have an official lying in state, and everybody was there. You can see the Duke, the Queen, Wallace is over here, and then Prince Philip was there. So it was a very official, proper lying in state for somebody that was, remember, he was once a king, so they gave him a lying in state. Let me just quickly do a sound check because my first chapter I'll have to reread it because it did not seem to record my voice. So how strange. Okay, so can you hear me? It looks like everything's going fine.
Okay, so can you...
But I'm gonna go ahead and start reading. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so here we are, Lying in State, Chapter 3, The Funeral, 1972. A clever photograph was taken of the lying in state at Windsor. It showed the Duke's catafalque in the middle of the empty nave at St. George's Chapel, as seen from across the tomb of King George V and Queen Mary, the parents with whom he had so often been at odds. As the new lay steward of St. George's Chapel, it was my duty for many hours during the Duke's lying in state, which took place throughout Friday the 2nd and Saturday the 3rd of June. My abiding memory of this atmosphere of solemnity and sadness, the queues stretch for miles down the hill, and those that wished to pay their respects had to wait patiently in line for hours. One old soldier, looking reserved and stiff, surreptitiously dropped some flowers as he passed a catafalque. He wanted to pay this tribute, but he did not want to be seen doing it, for fear he might be thought too sentimental. For one of my watches, I was on the north door, during which came the disabled in wheelchairs. Many were intensely moved. Particularly harrowing was the one lady who called out, "My prince," in a state of great emotion. Whatever the media said, it was clear that for those who came to pay their respects, their affection was undimmed. During those 2 days at Windsor, it was the young, charming Prince of Wales who was being remembered, not the Duke of Windsor. Yeah, he had spent quite a long time as Prince of Wales. He really cared about the poor people, so I can see where they had an affection for him. He was once referred to as the People's Prince. They did not remember him as the Duke of Windsor, who had deserted his subjects to take the supposed path of happiness. Famous figures came to the chapel. Harold Wilson, the leader of the opposition, he was one. Baroness Spencer Churchill was another. Lord Mountbatten had been busy since he had heard the news of the Duke's death in a telephone call from Sir Eric Penn from the previous Sunday morning. In his diary, he recorded that the Queen asked him to help her with the Duchess since he was the only member of the family who really knew her. He noted that she was worried that the Trooping of the Color would have to be canceled, and he took credit for thinking up the idea of a tribute to the Duke on the parade ground. He thought this was a wonderful idea, and he said he would follow up. Then he was asked to do a tribute by the BBC and argued with Sir Martin Charteris that Presidents Nixon and Pompidou had given tributes to the Duke, but there had been silence from the British royal family. The Queen gave her permission, provided I spoke about him in a balanced way. There was then some doubt about whether the Duchess would be well enough to attend the funeral. She was in a state of shock after the Duke's death, for which she had not been prepared, and she was understandably nervous at the prospect of staying with the royal family, though she was always determined to be at the funeral. Mountbatten was determined that he should come. He was determined that she should come, as she herself would be miserable if she missed the funeral, and the result on public opinion here would be disastrous. Lord Mountbatten went on to lying in state. Lord Mountbatten went to the lying in state on his way to the airport to greet the Duchess of Windsor. He left a wreath with an exaggerated message in happy memory of 53 years of friendship from his sorrowing but most devoted friend, the Duke. The Duchess overcame her fear of flying to arrive in Britain for the funeral. She traveled in an Andover of the Queen's flight, She was accompanied by Lady Solmes, the wife of the British ambassador in Paris, Grace, Countess of Dudley, widow of one of the Duke's oldest friends, Brigadier Douglas Greenacre, a former equerry to the Duke, and John Utter, Dr. Antonucci, her maid, Giselle de Berry, Monsignor Alexander, the famous Paris hairdresser who also went to London to ensure that the Duchess's hair was perfectly coiffed at all times. The Duchess was immensely elegant in black, with a small veil on her auburn hair. Mountbatten took her to Buckingham Palace in a royal Rolls-Royce and told her about the lying in state. When Mountbatten met the Duchess at the airport, he found she was nervous about having to confront the whole royal family, in particular the Queen Mother. He was assured her that the Queen Mother was deeply sorry for her in her present grief. When he mentioned his proposed BBC tribute, he said he would have to say how much he had disapproved of the abdication. She said, "You are quite right. You are quite right. I disapproved of it too. I spent a long time over a bad telephone line from France begging him not to abdicate. I went so far as to say if he did abdicate, I would not marry him." The Duchess was shown to her suite of rooms on the first floor of Buckingham Palace, overlooking the Mall and the Queen Victoria Memorial. She lunched with the Queen in the Chinese dining room. John Utter was surprised to be placed on the Queen's right. Later, he would tell his friends how immensely kind the Queen was to the Duchess during these difficult days. He said to the Duchess that she could come to the palace or Windsor, stay as long as she liked, and that no demands would be made of her. The Duchess told Sir Martin Charteris, "He gave up so much for so little. That evening, the Duchess had dinner with the Queen and Prince Charles, the Prince noting that she prattled away so that she was not sure if it was a brilliant facade or whether she was under such strain that she did not notice that the Duke had died. Afterwards, other members of the royal family joined them to watch Lord Mountbatten pay his tribute to the Duke of Windsor on television. The following day was the Queen's official birthday. I was lucky to have been given tickets for Trooping of the Color, which this year included a roll of drums followed by a minute's silence, a further roll of drums, and a lament, The Flowers and the Forest, played by pipers of the Scots Guard in memory of the Duke. In those days, the Queen still rode in the parade, this time wearing a mourning band on her left arm. All members of the royal family were in black. A famous photograph was taken of the Duchess of Windsor looking out of her suite in the rooms at the palace as the procession returned. Much has been made of the sorrow of the Duchess's brow. This might have been deceptive. She was waiting for a telephone call from her banker in Switzerland. Meanwhile, the royal family appeared on the balcony, among them Prince William of Gloucester, soon to die in an air crash taking part in a race. In the afternoon, the royal family went down to Windsor, leaving the Duchess at the palace. The Queen, Prince Philip, and Prince Anne visited the lying in state, entering the chapel via the deanery. Following the trooping, I made too many. Following the trooping, I too made my way to Windsor for my last duty at the lying in state in the afternoon. In due course, the last of the 57,903 members of the public had filed past, and the doors of the chapel were closed. I was still in the cloisters in the Canyon Verney's house when late that evening, the Duchess, along with John Utter, was met by Prince Charles and Lord Mountbatten and witnessed the lying in state. This part I did not see, as we were told by Admiral Davies, a lay steward and warden of St. George's House. This really must be private. He himself was going to be there, of course. Prince Charles walked down from the hill to St. George's Chapel, and Lord Mountbatten arrived by car. They were both there by the time the Duchess arrived from the palace with her party, including John Utter and Grace Dudley. The Duchess told Mountbatten that she was feeling very ill and sad, but went and stood at the head of the coffin for a few moments. She and Mountbatten then walked off all around the nave. Finally, she took one last glance at the coffin and said, "He was my entire life. I can't begin to think what I'm going to do without him. He gave up so much for me, and now he has gone. I've always hoped I would die before him." Then they walked around the cloisters and looked at the wreaths. The Duchess came and went, but I did not see her. Some months later, John Utter said he wished I had been there to help identify all the various wreaths from the foreign royal houses, from Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia and others. On the following day, John Utter replied to a great many letters and sent thanks for wreaths, all written on black bordered Buckingham Palace writing paper. The Duchess stayed quietly at the palace. She was visited by Sir Eric Penn to be briefed about the plans for Monday. Evidently confused, she appeared not to remember having seen the lying in state. Now we get to the Duke's funeral. The diary entry on Monday, the 5th of June was slight, but made one significant point. Funeral of the Duke of Windsor, deputed to meet the Duchess Secretary impression ceremony. It was an impressive ceremony. Long talked to her, re-invited to Paris, back to London with crown on car, watched A King's Story. I've been disappointed not to have been summoned for duty at the Duke's funeral, but on Sunday before it, the call came to say they needed an extra lay steward. In order to be able to enter the castle, I was to collect a black crown for my car from John Hancock, another lay steward, which would enable me to park in the castle car park. This was attached to the windscreen. Suitably attired in morning dress, I took my place at the briefing of the Queen's gentleman's usher and the lay steward, which took place in the south choir aisle. In those days, the gentlemen ushers were terrifying figures. General and air marshals, vice admirals, and colonels. In particular, I remember Sir Rodney Moore, an Osbert Lancaster version of a general, with a bristling white mustache, and on other occasions he could be seen arriving at Smith's Lawn for the polo in an enormous old-fashioned Rolls-Royce. With a formidable-looking wife seated beside him, they were a daunting bunch. Sir Eric Penn was issuing instructions, and among the things he mentioned was that at the last moment the Duchess Secretary and some of the staff from Paris were coming over for the service. The trouble is, he said, none of us know her or what she looks like. I mentioned to the man next to me that I had met Miss Schultz, and before I knew what was happening, I was in the midst of that terrifying group and was instructed to look after her. Sir Rodney Moore, 46 years my senior, was intrigued to know how I knew her. He boomed at me. How did you manage that, old boy? After that, a more restrained gentleman usher, Air Marshal Sir Maurice Heath, overseeing proceedings in the nave, took me under his wing. I spent the entire time before the service in the south door, thus witnessed the arrival of the invited mourners. Edward Heath, the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, the leader of the opposition, Earl and Countess of Avon, the Duke and Duchess of Buccleuch, Lord Brownlow, who was accompanied by Mrs. Simpson on her dramatic drive to the south of France in 1936. Now frail and leaning on a stick and accompanied by his wife and other figures from the abdication saga. Lady Diana Cooper came in with Cecil Beaton. They were placed in the nave, but Lady Diana did not like their seats and nudged them both into seats closer to the central aisle. Meanwhile, the Duchess arrived at Windsor via Frogmore Gate with Grace Dudley sitting next to her. She was driven to the deanery in Windsor Castle, where Lord Mountbatten was again on hand to introduce her to all the royal family in turn. The royal ladies then took their place in the choir, and the funeral procession made its way down the north aisle on the chapel to the great west door. Miss Schutz herself did not arrive at the beginning of the service. Her plane was grounded in one of those summer smogs at the airport in France. She was only arrived after the service had begun, at which time we lay stewards were lined up at the back of the nave. From that position, we saw the coffin come around the corner, past the tomb of George V and Queen Mary. It was duly carried the full length of the nave, followed by the Duke of Edinburgh walking with King Olaf of Norway. The Prince of Wales was walking alone. Princes William and Richard of Gloucester, the Duke of Kent with Prince Michael, and Lord Mountbatten with the Duke of Beaufort. The service itself took place in the choir. There came the historic moment when Garter, King of Arms, called out the styles and titles of the Duke. ending with the words, "Sometimes the Most High, most mighty, the most excellent monarch, Edward VIII, Emperor of India, defender of the faith, uncle of the Most High, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Queen Elizabeth, whom God bless." It was a reminder that it was one of the Britain's kings who was to be laid to rest. The most perceptive account of all this was written by Cecil Beaton. He had been reluctant to attend and only did so in order to describe it in his diary. Okay. The service was short and entirely noble. It even gave a departed nobility to a young man who once had such charm that everyone considered that he was the ideal choice. But he lived on to keep his charm and little else. And one wondered how lucky we all were that even for such an unsuitable reason as the hard, brash, and wisecracking American, he had stepped down to make way for the Queen Mother, and now the very admirable and remarkable Queen Elizabeth. Wonderful as that service was, I was not moved by the death of this man who for less than a year had been our king. History will make his love story into a romance. In fact, for us so close, it's hard to see that. Wallace has been a good friend to me. I like her. She's a good friend to all her friends. There is no malice in her. There's nothing dislikable in her. She is just not of the degree that has reason to be around the throne. During these last days of death, she has behaved with extreme dignity. She has, by the simplicity of her silhouette, made the rest of the royal family appear dowdier than ever. But she made me marvel once again that she should ever have become a figure in such a drama. During the service, the Duchess appeared lost and wore of a frown of worry and distraught and bewilderment. This confirmed that rumors that Cecil Beaton had heard from French friends that she was unwell. Lady Avon, seated directly behind the Duchess, told him that throughout the service the Queen showed a motherly and nanny-like tenderness and kept putting her hand on the Duchess's arm and glove. When the service ended, the royal family all left by the north choir aisle. I therefore saw a number of royal ladies pass by the coffin, which remained in its place in front of the high altar. One of these was the Duchess. I cannot even be quite certain which one she was. Having seen innumerable photographs since, I can of course picture her in my mind with her thick black crepe widow's veil. She was the only mourner who was heavily veiled that day. After the service, I found Miss Schultz elegant in one of those smart black coats with the large black buttons, and took her to see the coffin along with the flowers outside the lawns of the castle. I obtained a service sheet for her and finally reunited her with Dr. Antonucci in the chapter office in the cloisters. "It's so sad for the Duchess," she said. My brief diary entry reminds me that she also said that I should come and see them again in Paris next time I was there. I now realize that this was just a courteous remark, but I took it as a golden invitation, the green light to visit them again, and it was not long before I made a considerable detour. In order to do so, had I not done so, I would not have been able to write this book. Only now, nearly 40 years after laying in state, have I been able to see all the documentation for the lying in state at the funeral. The Duchess of Windsor sat behind the Queen and Prince Philip. Next to them sat King Olav of Norway. and then the Queen Mother. Those located in the choir were largely members of the royal family, the cabinet ministers, senior representatives from the armed forces, the county, figures such as Harold Macmillan and Knights of the Garter, the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Avon, Sir Gerald Templar, and Viscount Cobain, and their wives. Many of these would have little, if any, personal contact with the Duke himself, but were there for formal reasons. There were some figures from the Windsor's past, Sir John Arid, Sir Alexander, and Commander Colin Booth. Of friends, it was interesting to find Mr. and Mrs. Lowell Guinness, Francis Munn Baker, Mr. and Miss Borey, the annoyance of the Grand French since M. Borey owned Fauchon, and they deemed to be his grocer. Reinhard Henschel. Of their staff, there was Georges the butler, Gregorio Martin the chauffeur, Lucien Massey the chef, Henry Bertrand, and Sidney Johnson the valet. And of their lawyers, Sir Godfrey and Lady Morley and Senator Jacques Roselli. Places were reserved for Dr. Thynne and Mrs. Schutz, and the household apothecary and a nursing sister were in the vestry throughout the service in case they were needed. There was no mention of Maitre Suzanne Blum, the Windsor's Paris lawyer. She was not on the list. She is a pretty key figure in the end of the life of Wallis Simpson, of Duchess of Windsor. She was not a very good character. So after the funeral, there was a lunch for the royal family in the castle. One member of the royal family was surprised when the Queen, speaking of the Duchess, said, "It's so difficult because she hardly knows anyone." Lord Mountbatten looked after her, sitting next to the Duchess on the sofa before the lunch, and beside her during the meal. She kept saying how wonderful the family were being to her and how much better the whole thing had gone than she had expected. At the lunch itself, she sat at a table between the Duke of Edinburgh and Lord Mountbatten. On her return to Paris, the Duke's old friend, Walter Lees, was one of the first to come to dinner with her. "Wasn't that the most fine service?" she asked. He nodded, though he hadn't been there. She then told him that she was horrified by Prince Philip. He turned to her at lunch and asked, "Well, what are your plans? You going back to America then?" She felt like saying, "Why should I?" In the end, she said to him, "I won't be coming back to England, if that's what you're afraid of, except to visit his grave." She was determined that they, the royal family, were not to see her grieve, and she was amused by the way they all tucked into their puddings. Another topic discussed was the fate of the Duke's papers. Prince Philip asked the Duchess what she intended to do with them. She was keen only to do what was considered right, and asked the Duke and Mountbatten what they thought she ought to do with them, and they replied that they would come to Windsor. They should come to Windsor. To this she readily agreed. As a result of this, as we shall see, the librarian, Sir Robin Mackworth Young, paid 2 visits to Paris to collect such papers and they were handed over. John Utter was placed next to the Queen Mother, who asked him lots of questions about the Windsor's life in Paris. He was surprised how interested she was. Utter had been nervous of her because Lady Brabourne, Mountbatten's elder daughter, now the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, had warned him that the Queen Mother had an iron fist and a velvet glove. The original intention had been that the Queen Mother would not go to Frogmore for the committal, but at the last moment she decided that she would. This took place in the afternoon. The Queen stood next to the Duchess as the Duke's body was lowered into the ground. Where would you like it to be? Where would you like to be? To his right or to his left? She asked. The Duchess thought for a moment, and she considered it unlikely that many flowers would be placed on her grave. But she spotted a plane tree. She loved the leaves of plane trees and often collected these from her garden and placed them on her dressing table. She liked the idea that the leaves would fall onto her grave in the autumn. She also noted that so often in life she'd been in the Duke's shadow, so she chose the side to the left, where she would be in the shade and under the spreading branches of the plane tree. The same afternoon, in the House of Commons in London, tributes were made to the Duke and an address of sympathy was voted to be sent to the Queen. After extolling the Duke's virtues, especially as the Prince of Wales and briefly as a modernizing king, Edward Heath, the Prime Minister, expressed the House's sadness for the Queen. He then referred to the Duchess, the wife for whose love King Edward was content to give up his patrimony, who has repaid his devotion with an equal loyalty, companionship, and love. His death has been above all her loss, and to her the House will wish to extend its profound sympathy. Harold Wilson, the leader of the opposition, concurred. We welcome the Duchess has felt able to be in Britain and to hear and sense the feeling of our people, and all of us appreciate the dignity she has shown not only over those tragic days, but over all the years. We hope she will feel free to come among us and freely communicate with the people. Her husband, Prince, King, and Duke live to serve. An amendment was moved to include the Duchess's name in the motion of sympathy, and this was agreed. Back at Windsor, it was time for the Duchess to leave. The entire royal family was gathered at the steps of the castle to say goodbye to her. As she got into her car, Mountbatten was disappointed that he had not been assigned to the duty of escorting the Duchess to the airport, especially as the press the next day made much of the absence of a member of the royal family at the airport to wish her goodbye. The Duchess was escorted to Heathrow by Lord Maclean, the new Lord Chamberlain, and the ladies in waiting, assigned to look after her while in London. Thus, there were images of Lord Maclean not bowing and the ladies in waiting shaking hands, though poignantly not cursing. John Utter was another who was saddened that his image was the one that endured, as it appeared, to contradict the Queen's consideration and kindness during the visit. The Duchess flew back to France, arriving at Villecoblay and then being driven to her home in Bois. The image of the Duchess, her crepe veil blowing gently in the wind as she mounted the aluminum steps of the Andover, with the RAF officer saluting and the Lord Chamberlain standing rigidly at the bottom of the steps, gave Frances Donaldson a romantic, not strictly accurate, but nevertheless memorable last line for her book on the Duke. A fraction of a second in the Duchess's life had been immobilized by the camera, but it seemed entirely final. She would not turn again, one felt, for a last look at the land her husband had given up for her, and this was the ending of an episode in the history of England and in the long life of its leading family. That should have been the end of the story. However, very much better it would have been for the Duchess of Windsor to have followed her husband swiftly to his grave at Frogmore. As Una Shanley, who nursed the Duke in his last days, put it, the years that followed the Duke's death were unspeakably lonely for the Duchess. This period could fill many pages and could be compared to Dante's vision of hell. She was a martyr at the hands of greedy people. And that is a very poignant statement throughout the book about how she was taken advantage of. And it's so easy to take advantage of elderly. And it's a very sad story. No matter what your opinions are of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, it's very sad the way the Duchess of Windsor had lived her life in the end. But we're going to read the next chapter in a different episode, The Duchess and Her Household in 1972. And this is chapter 4. So that will be in a different episode. Thank you very much for listening.